Welcome back, everyone. In the last class, we have been giving a background of the decolonial sociological school. So we talked about there are two kinds of decolonial sociological school that Sujata Patel has identified. So now in this class, we will go into details of this both schools within the decolonial traditions. The first is the indigenous sociologies. So Patel actually builds her idea of indigenous sociologies based on the works of two important indigenous sociologists. The first is D.P. Mukerji, who was one of the earliest, who is also known as the father of Indian sociology, more or less, along with G.S. Curry and all, and who, as you can, lived largely during the British colonial period and also in the immediate years of the independent nation. And other is Akinsola Akiwowo, who is an African sociologist, who was a professor of sociology in University of Ife in Nigeria, and who was fundamental in the production or in the formation of indigenous sociology in the African context. So here in what is common in both D.P. Mukerji's and Akiwowo's sociology is the idea of sociology as a culturally specific discipline. It represents theories that capture particular experiences and practices of various communities, and thus is particularistic in character. That is a key word in understanding indigenous sociology. The idea is that there is no universal sociology possible. They actually resist the idea that sociological theories has to be produced from the Europe and then imported and applied in African and Asian context. Instead, they propose the idea of sociology as a culturally specific discipline, so that sociological ideas of each context has to be produced within that context. So these practices and experience are related to specific values, and the indigenization of social sciences should thus be based on understanding of this particular value. So this is a fundamental premise of indigenous sociologies that we will be talking, and is common to both Mukerji and Akiwowo. So first we will talk about D.P. Mukerji. So D.P. Mukerji was largely based in University of Calcutta and later in the Aligarh Muslim University. He was also foundational to the formation of All India Sociological Conference, one of the first organization of Indian sociologists. So he's a pioneer in Indian sociology. So he's a very important character, important central figure in the project of building an indigenous or a nationalistic social sciences in Indian context. So he attempt to create a sociological theory of modernity or Indian modernity based on Indian condition, circumstances, and civilizational legacies. Right? So based on this idea, and he argued that Indian modernity, or how India has encountered or been encased with the idea of modernity, cannot be assessed in the social scientific language of conflict. So we know that many of the early sociologist schools were largely interested in the idea of conflict, be it class conflict, be it conflict between religious communities. So this idea of conflict has been central to a European idea of modernity, right? Especially in the Marxist tradition and so on. Then he actually attempt to argue that Indian modernity cannot be understood based on the idea of conflict or largely conflict theories that come from the West, but instead it should be formulated as a theory based on cultural symbiosis, which he argued is the outstanding feature of India's long civilization history. So this comes from a differential understanding between how the historical experience has been constituted in India and the Europe. While Europe has a very conflictual history which has so large scale violence, which actually remade the European society from time to time, in India it was not the context. India has always had symbiosis of some or the other form. It has an idea of civilizational affinity to all kind of classes, all kind of faith, all kind of sociological communities, and therefore the idea of conflict theories is not applicable to understand Indian experience. Rather, Indian sociology should formulate an idea of cultural symbiosis or social symbiosis that is drawn based on our own civilization history. So this is one of his larger central tenet of his sociological formulation. And In developing from these premises, he elaborated the principles of Indian cultural symbiosis through three Sanskrit concepts. The first is the idea of Shandam, which translates as harmony, that which sustains the universe amidst all its incessant changes. So there is an idea of harmony, social cultural harmony, that is central to the idea of cultural symbiosis, which is a central framework through which he understood Indian modernity or Indian society. The second is Shivam, which refers to as welfare, being the principle of coordination with the social environment. So it's not conflict, but large coordination with one's own social environment. And finally, the idea of Advaitam, the unity or synthesis, and these concepts being drawn from his understanding of Hindu scriptures. So one could actually easily identify certain problematics here, that all his idea of Indian civilization is more or less is synonymous with a certain idea of Hindu civilization, right? But this is where he formulated his own sociological theories. And one need to understand that he doesn't have any particular political affiliation with, let's say, a Hindu nationalist project, but this derived from his own affinity to produce an authentic Indian nationalistic sociology, right? Part of the larger indigenous social science project. And now we will go to the second scholar, Akinsola Akiwowo. So we have a quote from one of his work in 1980, which actually lays out his central project. He writes that Africans shows that they are highly influenced by North American sociologists, for whom they show far greater respect than they demonstrate towards their own colleagues. Classical writers like Augustus Comte, Durkheim and Weber continue to be relevant whenever African sociology seeks to clarify for others and for themselves their own ideal societies. Otherwise, the painful truth is that African sociologists are woefully ignorant of the excellent work being done by the colleague, both inside and outside their own countries. So this is the general discontent out of which Akiwowo built his indigenous social theories, is that the African sociologist in Africa has much more respect for sociological ideas and sociological thinkers who comes from a very different context, who know nothing about African society, and simultaneously they does not acknowledge or look at the valuable sociological knowledge produced from their own surroundings. So this is the fundamental discontent that Akiwowo has. And then Akiwowo, he initiated a debate on indigeneity in Africa or indigenous knowledge in Africa by affirming that sociology can be constituted from tales, myths and proverbs of the people together with the laws of true African wisdom. So this is very important. So what becomes the source of an African indigenous sociology? And for Akiwowo, the source of African indigenous sociology is the local tales, myth, proverbs and other kind of literary productions, that oral tradition that comes from African tribal communities themselves, and which according to him conceals the actual truths about African wisdom, the law of truth among African wisdom. So he was the Department of Sociology of the University of Nigeria. He and his colleagues attempt to put together a sociological theory extracted from the poetry of the Yoruba tribe in Nigeria. So Yoruba tribe is one of the largest tribal communities in Nigeria, and he tried to build a sociology of the Yoruba tribe, or social theory that comes from the Yoruba tribe, based on an critical understanding, engagement with a lot of poetry, which has largely been in the oral traditions. So he and his colleagues has published works after work and built a lot of sociological concept that is completely derived from their engagement with various oral poetic traditions within the Yoruba tribe of Nigeria. And one of the central concepts that he used, this is an example of how he built his sociological idea, is the idea of Asuvada, which asserts that through the unit of all social life is individual, though the unit of all social life is individual, and individual as a corporeal self needs fellowship of other individuals. So this is the idea of asavada, right? This is very different from how the individual is conceptualized in the Western sociology. And as a consequence, community life based on a common good is sui generis to the existence of the individual within the Yoruba tribe. There is no necessary conflict of interest between the individual and the community, right? So this is one example of how his sociology has been built. However, this indigenous sociologist has not been without criticisms. They did not sustain as very appealing in the social science traditions, even in the indigenous or in the local context. For example, Patel herself argues that these concepts cannot serve to create an objective, acceptable scientific theory. So the idea is that to build an alternative indigenous sociological theory, should we do it at the cost of having an objective and acceptable scientific theory? It shouldn't be. That's what Patel argues and says the kind of sociology that indigenous sociologists like D.P. Mukerji or Akiwowo constructed does not stand the test of objectivity. And also, the kind of sociology that both of them, Mukerji and Akiwowo, produce does not account for the diverse social spheres within their own society. For example, the idea of sociology that Akiwowo produced from the Yoruba tribe may not be sensible or may not be useful to understand the self-understanding of other communities within Nigeria. Similarly, the kind of sociological concept that D.P. Mukerji derived from largely a Hindu Brahmanical civilizational concepts may not be useful to understand the social life of the large population who are outside such religious cultural sphere, right? So it is not even useful to understand a large part of their own context. Similarly, and Patel also says it's important to ask how these sociologists have created the methods to examine the truth claims of these indigenous claims. So there's a methodological flow. So they take it as it is. There's a form of essentialism involved in it. And Pauline Handonji, and a major African sociologist whom we will discuss in after a few minutes, he actually says this indigenous knowledge of the kind that Akiwowo produced does not dialogue with the Western thinking and science. So Hondonji says even the decolonial tradition has to be in constant dialogue with the kind of sociology that we produced elsewhere, especially in the West. It need not derive from it uncritically, but it has to be in dialogue, right? And says the indigenous sociology fails to do that, and they have not developed an understanding of science and elaborated ways to interrogate its own assumptions. So as I already said, one of the key strong points about science that it can be used to interrogate its own assumptions, right? So therefore it can always develop, it can also grow by being self-critical, and the kind of framework that Mukerji and Akiwowo produce does not have that strength because they take it as it is. They take from certain essential understanding of their own societies. So they fail to advance a science of society according to Pauline Handonji. So there are other critique that Patel advances, that indigenous sociologies, given the nationalist stand, retain the taken for understanding of what constitute the official culture or philosophical discourse, agendas, loyalties, and histories of their nations and communities, and therefore they reduce social sciences to the boundaries of nation state, which we call as a methodological nationalism. So they have suffered from a problem of methodological nationalism, which means for them what constitutes society is a society that has been deemed inside the boundaries of a nation state. For example, let's think about India. Let's think about someone who is studying about the Punjab society, right? So earlier Punjab means the kind of Punjab that was included in both Pakistan and India in today's, right? And they have a lot of shared commonalities as a single geographical union. But now it is part of two distinct nation states, and therefore when we study Punjab from India, it is part of the larger Indian sociology, and it is being taken as a separate nation state with its own characteristic, and Pakistan's Punjab is entirely with different its own characteristics. Therefore we fails to understand the commonalities between these two societies just because it was divided by a national boundaries, which only came into being in 1947. So such political compulsions, such nationalistic compulsions becomes a deterministic factor of our understanding of society itself. So this is a problem of methodological nation state. Nation state becomes a unit of society, right? And this is a fundamental problem with the indigenous sociology. And Patel contends that indigenous sociologies, they represent racist, ethnic, patriarchal perceptions of the region's nation state, and they actually produced certain colonial or Western understanding of non-Western societies. So, this actually plays out in the binaries of the universal versus particular, Western versus non-Western, because there is no dialogue between both traditions. So Patel then raises two issues concerning an alternative, a better decolonial sociology that does not suffer from the pitfalls of the indigenous sociology. So she says there are two important things to keep in mind. One is an institutional change, right? Because in today there are greater connections in contemporary global knowledge economy, but that in turn deepen the hegemony of the global north, right? For example, now there is a greater flow of academics from the non-Western to Western societies, and as well as Western to non-Western society. But the West remains to be the center of this cultural flow, right? This kind of political, economic, and global cultural flows, especially after globalization, needs to be keep in mind if you have to develop a decolonial critique in contemporary times. And secondly, is that the recent interventions has largely looked at how sociological knowledge or category itself is being produced, right? Which she calls as an epistemic turn. So she says, does this epistemic turn alone produce a way out to decolonize sociology? So that's an important point she asked before we delve into the second, a more revisionist and sophisticated understanding of decolonialism. So I call this, or she called this, a neo-Marxist understanding, but that is not actually a self-descriptive understanding. And there are different, she identified three specific schools within it. First is a Latin American school, and second comes from the work of the subaltern studies school in Indian context, and thirdly the kind of work that new African sociologists like Paul Nhondonji produces. So they are independent of each other, but nevertheless he finds different concepts and categories that actually advances the project of decolonization within sociology. So the first Latin American school is largely derived from the work of people like Anibal Cajano and people like Walter Mignolo, who talked about the idea of coloniality of power, right? So the idea is that it looks at the epistemic linkages between coloniality and modernity. So how the modernity of the non-Western, in this case Latin American context, itself was informed by certain colonial assumption, right? That is very central to the idea. And they also talked about the idea of Eurocentrism, that how our modern sociology in the self, the I, is automatically taken as a Europe, and the other is the non-European, the global peripheries, and how these two being connected intimately as binaries, right? For example, certain idea of evolutionism, progress, and other binaries, dualities are kind of constituents of our modern social science theories, right? So these kind of, so in that way, all the sociological theories automatically give privilege to the experiences of European people and the society, its economic organization, which is the capitalist market, and its political organization, which is the liberal democratic and the European nation state, and legitimize these as the natural forms of economic and political existence. So the question is that, do all societies has to be essentially be nation state as we know today? Was this a natural process, or it was a very elaborated, very consciously created project, was associated with certain forms of power relations and exploitative process like colonialism? So we need to think that whether India became a nation state as we see today, was it because of our own wish and a natural process, or is a result of a complex history which involves process of exploitation and inequalities and extraction and so on. So this is an important insight that the Latin American school has put forward. And along with it, Patel says an idea that Pauline Hondonji put forward, which is an idea of extraversion, is particularly important to understand the certain predicaments of contemporary the continuing colonization within global sociology. Hondonji identified there's a clear division of labor between the center and the metropole, which is the center is the European society, and the periphery is a non-Western society. So there's a clear division of labor. That and there's a fundamental problem of extraversion and the so cut. Yeah, so Hondonji identified division of labor where the theory is being produced in the center and the empirical testing of the theory is being done in the peripheries. So we know that a lot of people from the West, all of them has Center for South Asian Studies, Center for African Studies, Center for Latin American Studies, and what they do essentially is test the theories. There are certain sociological, political concept that has been produced based on the Western experiences, and they kind of uncritically apply it to the Western, non-Western society. So this is this in more simplistic terms, the division of labor that Hondonji refers to, and he identified there's a fundamental problem of being oriented to source of authority outside their own society. So let's say if you're studying Indian society, what are the sources of authority, where it comes from? And most of our theories, most of the source of authority of our society comes from the West. Even if someone's, people from Indian academics often go to sabbaticals in the north, on the global north, and that gives them a lot of legitimacy for their own academic reads in Indian context, right? So the sources of authority of academic knowledge produced even in the global south is the global north. So the global north is always the source of academic legitimacy, which Hondonji refers to as a problem of extraversion. And this essentially will lead to an uncritical application of research specialization, topics and questions to one's own context. How certain new disciplines have been emerged. For example, we know that there are disciplines after disciplines, journals after journals have been produced based on new specialization, but all of them are produced in the north and then being exported to the south. And this will lead to an important problem, that there will be an absence of knowledge of larger philosophical and scientific understanding of one's own society, right? How many of Indian sociologists are completely aware of the certain knowledge system with all its shortcomings and problems existed in the Indian context? Very few, right? We are more familiar with the kind of knowledge systems that have been produced in the West rather than our own society. And Hondonji concludes that it ultimately promotes a sort of brain drain and an intellectual tourist circuit between the core and periphery. And that's a very important point. One need to be self-critical here. A lot of people in the premier institute in the global south, let's take IIT, all of them will go for conferences, workshop, sabbaticals and fellowships to the global north, which he calls either is a form of brain drain or an intellectual tourist circuit, right? Most of the Western societies, Western thinkers or Western sociologists come and study the societies in the global south, and they go back to their own society and produce theory from there, right? So this global south becomes a mere context of extracting data, but always the theory is produced in the global north. Similarly, even those people who largely work in the global south has either aspires to go to the global north to produce theory, or themselves grow as part of sabbaticals or fellowships or in the form of conferences. So this global circuit of intellectual tourist circuit that Hondonji polemically calls is a very important point in understanding contemporary forms of knowledge production. And the second school that Patel talks about is the Subaltern Studies Collective, in which she particularly focused on Partha Chatterjee's idea of colonial difference. So we had talked about subaltern studies in detail in the previous classes. So I won't go into details. So there is a fundamental problem of colonial differences that Partha Chatterjee refers to is a paradox. Right, the colonialism, according to Chatterjee, is producing a paradox that you have to self-improve using colonial cultural resources, but then remain subordinate and suppliant to colonization. So these colonial differences, according to Chatterjee, the subaltern scholars, is being reproduced in the social sciences, nationalistic social sciences, as well as Western social sciences, including sociology. So this is a very important point. Similarly, the author herself, Sujata Patel, also put forward an idea of colonial modernity, where it is not only about modernity experienced in the colony or the period of colonialism, but it's the way colonialism constituted ideas, ideologies, and knowledge systems of the natives. So basically, but what Chatterjee, as Patel says, in Chatterjee's idea of colonial difference and Patel's idea of colonial modernity, is about how certain colonialist assumptions continue to shape our own or the colonized idea about their own society. Certain binaries, certain assumptions, and how that continue to persist is what Patel refers as colonial modernity. The study of sociology, then, for example, let's take for Patel, she takes the idea of Indian sociology in its formative years, especially, or even the later years. The study of sociology was to comprehend a society called traditional through three institutions. So she actually, in other works, actually surveys a few of major in early Indian sociology, such as M.N. Srinivas, and then she says most of the understanding of society in India actually refers to traditional society, what they think as a traditional society, and within that actually confined to three important social institutions such as the family, marriage, kinship, and then the caste, and then the belief and religiosities. So all of which were thought to be located geographically in village India. So sociology was study of village India in the nationalistic indigenous sociological scheme. And the study of the modern in the form of the industrial and the urban was given a very little importance. So this is one of the problem of colonial modernity that continues to define or shape, let's say, Indian sociology. So as students of Indian sociology, you need to think about this insight about your previous classes, and you will see how a lot of assumptions or a lot of focus of Indian sociology even today continues to be in these three social institutions, which are largely about rural or village India. Of course, there has been advancement. Of course, there has been a lot of sociological knowledge about the urban, but this continues to be important, and this is what Patel says a problem of colonial modernity. So, what we have discussed so far is there are two kinds of decolonial school emerged within the global south. First is indigenous sociology, and it who was actually concerned about producing culturally specific sociological knowledge, and we have seen enough critique of indigenous sociology that come within the global south. And then we also see the next second school or more recent and refined school of decolonial critique. We discuss three different strands within that: the Latin American school, who actually put forward an idea of Eurocentrism, and secondly the subaltern studies school, who was focused on colonial difference, and Sujata Patel herself talked about the problem of colonial modernity, and you also discussed Pauline Honderji's idea of extraversion. So we will see these are not coherent, very internally connected, but very similar forms of sociological thinking, which an assumption which will problematize the idea of problematize the continuing forms of colonialities in global social sciences knowledge paradigms. So given this, how our decolonial thinking in sociology can go ahead? So Patel concludes her essay with a few points. The first is that we need to keep in mind that there are diverse intellectual decolonial critics. It is not a full-fledged, it's not a single institution or a single body of thinking, but there is multiple currents within the decolonial thinking we have talked about in last class. And in today, there is a lot of talk about crisis of sociology, especially in the West, which is largely about the problem of globalization, right? How globalization as a process has drastically changed European society with migration, with more ICT, information and communication technique, and the idea of risk, right? There has been a very important, valuable body of work on sociology of risk produced by scholars such as Ulrich Beck, and there is and who argued that with the increasing possibility of risk, the conventional sociological theories produced by Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and so on are no more very relevant. So this is the understanding of crisis of sociology that Western sociologist has. But then Patel says, but then at the same time, the decolonial critique poses a more fundamental question of crisis of sociology, which is about the continuing coloniality of sociology itself. Right? We have talked about how the global flows of knowledge production, or how the sociological concept within the global, what is termed as global sociology or universal sociology, is actually very Eurocentric. We already talked about this. So in that way, the decolonial critique poses a more fundamental questions about the crisis of sociology as a discipline itself. And then another important point is that the colonial critic points out, it assumes, or it asserts, that knowledge circulates through circuits, and the circuits are established during colonialism. So the kind of circuits between the West and the non-West, where the West is the hegemonic center, continues to be the circuit of knowledge production even in this post-globalization world. And Patel says, so it's very important. So decolonization theories need to pose two kinds of critique to sociology. One is institutional critique, how the power relation between the institutions in the global north and the global south, and the epistemic critique, how the ideas of sociology is actually Eurocentric. So the decolonial critique within sociology is actually directed at both institutional and epistemic critique of sociology. Yeah, so the takeaway from the class is the idea is to give a broad introduction to the decolonial thinking within sociology, and as you can clearly see that the decolonial thinking in sociology is not a coherent body of thinking, but actually comes from diverse regional and geographical and intellectual traditions who actually laid bare the problem of contemporary global sociology and this continuing power relations in the sociological knowledge production, right? So here are, if you're interested in further, here are some of the other works that actually talks about decolonial critique and sociology. The first is by Raven Connell, who's an Australian sociologist who produced very valuable work, and also then attempt to put forward an alternative sociological canon, where she described the important, valuable sociological work produced by sociologists in the global south, and she published as a book called The Southern Theory. And there is this very important work by Gurminder Pambra and John Hongfoot about colonialism and modern social theory. It's about how it's a very self-critical work, as being sociologists from the global north themselves. They actually talk about how the modern social theory and its formative assumptions has been informed and influenced by the process of colonialism itself. And there's a recent work by Dilip, it's an edited book by Dilip Menon, and this can be called as a new attempt in reproducing certain valuable assumptions of the indigenous sociology, where they try to put forward theoretical concept from the global south. So this is very similar to the project proposed by Akiwowo and Mukerji, but in a more refined and self-critical matter. So these are three important works. If you're interested, you can have a look at, and you will understand the kind of directions that sociology takes, especially with the interventions of the decolonial critique. And there are two websites. First is the Connected Sociology, which is managed by Gurminder Bambra, and Global Social Theory. These are two websites that actually put together various resources on decolonial and other resources and schools in global social or sociological theory. I hope you got an overview of decolonial schools. Thank you for listening.